Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you're here with us for our October webinar on Climate Policies 101 with Randylitzenberger. It's great that each of you has taken the time to be with us. Our October focus is the climate policies and our, oh, wait a minute. Nope. All right. Can you see the second slide? Somebody? Has it moved to the second slide for you?
Yes, it has.
Everything's
Coming
fine.
just in seconds.
Okay, great. So during the month of October, we'll have a follow-up conversation on Policies 101 next week, starting at 2 o'clock. And Randy will be joining us to answer questions. And then in November, we will focus on communities making a difference. And we're specifically asking for people whose congregations are making efforts to mitigate climate change, reduce energy usage, reduce carbon emissions, create or, do some efforts. Connect with me and either send me a video of what you're doing or the name and address, contact information for someone that I can talk to and record them talking to me about what the congregation is doing. We're collecting videos to use in November and after that in other webinars as well. So please get back to us with that kind of information. You can put your name in the chat if you have something to offer, or you can send me an email, something of that nature. It's SD Oxley, Susan Diane Oxley, sdoxley@yahoo.com. In today's webinar, we will be considering some of the political approaches to handling the climate emergency. Climate policy and legislation are multi-layered. They're very complex and can be confusing for the average person like me. So what Randy will do today is give us a beginner's guide to policy types and scope and interactions, all the way from city to national governments. Randylitzenberger is a friend of mine. I have known him through my daughter ever since he and my daughters were in high school. But he is now the co-chair of Seattle's 34th District Environment, Energy, and Land Use Caucus. He's been a climate mitigation advocate for many years, and he's managed to even get me involved in political advocacy. He is a high school teacher specializing in social and policy issues, and he's researched global, federal, and state legislation for years. He's used to teaching basic concepts to people who are beginning their journey of understanding political legislation and advocacy. He invites politicians, advocates, youth advocates to speak to us in our caucus meetings. And when he's not busy with all of that, he also leads a United Nations simulation game that is fascinating. It's on global policies and funding for climate mitigation, and it helps people experience both the complexity of the international needs concerning climate challenges and also the importance of nations working together to solve the crisis we face. Randy likes to spend time with his wife and 2 kids, and for this webinar especially, he's done research specifically on Canada and the US. His presentation is just as applicable to nations outside of North America. That's primarily developing nations. Now, Randy's going to pick up questions from the chat box and try to answer them as this presentation goes along. So please write your questions in the chat box, and you can direct them either to Randy directly or to everyone, and we'll make sure that they get to him. I want to remind you that in our church, it's not appropriate, because we are nonprofit status, it's not appropriate for us to be partisan. So congregations, church-sponsored activities, the world church as a whole, we have to remain nonpartisan and not promote any one party or any one candidate or denigrate any party or candidate. And so as you have an opportunity today and next week to talk about issues, please make sure that you are participating by sharing about the issues, not about parties or candidates. You can share your issues freely, but remember, we're a diverse and inclusive community and everybody's welcome. So thank you, Randy. Thanks for sharing with us. I'll turn the screen over to you now for your PowerPoint presentation and the information that you've shared.
Well, thank you, Susan. I appreciate that gracious introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. As I bring things up on screen for us here, I would guess I would add one thing to the Vita, that if you see me reaching for the Yeti mug here, I'm coming off the wonderful head cold that my family's been sharing here in the last several days. So forgive the scratchy throat and the like. I'll do the best I can. I got the throat coat, I got the cough drop, and we are ready to go. So pleased to be here with so many folks from across the United States, across Canada, and beyond as well. And shout out to Annie Phillips, my partner in crime of the 34th Democrats EELU, who's joining us here today. Better than half of the praise that Susan has heaped on me here today already deserves to go to Annie as well. So pleasure to have her in our company too, along with this great group. So I wanted to start things off here with the presentation as we go, and I will be trying to watch for questions and the like. As you can probably tell already, I'm used to teaching at a high school level, which means I need to fit things into usually a 50-minute period. So I'll be moving along pretty quickly. I will be monitoring the chat box there for questions. I know Susan and others will give me a little nudge there if I happen to miss something for your question, or if you prefer, you can hold your question till the end. I will try to make either possible here in terms of responding to them. The graphic that's in front of you, I'm borrowing from Grist magazine, as you'll note there. And I think it frames the first aspect of the presentation. Yes, we're going to be delving into policy. We'll be talking about different ideas at the local, provincial and state, and then national level, and even a bit beyond for the international level. But we first have to understand kind of the elephant in the room, which is this challenge, the psychology of addressing this. Maybe I'm more sensitive to it because as a high school teacher, whenever I bring up this topic with my students, you can just see their shoulders slump. And the question that often comes from them, and I'll put it into more gentle terms here, is, well, how much trouble are we in? They use different and sometimes more colorful language than that, but I think you get the idea. And what often students receive, and what I think the public receives when we talk about climate, is the sense of the latest disaster. And we'll frame that here. We can't ignore that. We have to be cognizant of it. But I also like to think that there is, though there's a debate on which method is best for this, there's the question of a more hopeful message, one that acknowledges the challenges, the reality of it, doesn't shrink from it, but also is able to construct a hopeful message for us as we proceed. So I want to keep those things in mind as we go. I think this is a useful graphic that can give you that sense of the start of it before we dive into policy. So if we can, let's take a look here. When we think about climate doom, I mean, we're all familiar with the headlines. You don't have to look very far to be able to see the challenges that are there. Whether it was the recent hurricane Ida hitting landfall in Louisiana just late this summer and the devastation that wrought, whether we're talking about Australia in terms of its fires from the last couple of years back in January of 2020, with drought and the like, making for a more vulnerable continent and its communities in terms of fires, the impacts there. Talking about Jakarta in Indonesia in terms of the areas that had been previously flood prone for it and are now seeing much more dramatic results of that, with flooding taking place there. In our own backyard here, in my backyard anyway, here in Washington State, I'm in West Seattle, we know that this was the hottest June on record for the contiguous United States, and the circumstances that seem to show an acceleration of those tendencies over the last century plus of recorded data, and how that has affected communities, even destroying communities in British Columbia. Our thoughts are very much with here as we understand the impact that has had here and on the other side of the border. Of course, fires in the Amazon are becoming much more prevalent, the worst in the past decade here, as we have seen. And we understand too that climate change is an increasing threat in Africa, even impacting what we hear is a doomsday glacier, talk about a doom message in Antarctica. we're not critiquing these in terms of their presence. We acknowledge the reality of the circumstances, but the other reality is that we can get inundated by this. It can be too much. It can be overwhelming. And at least with my students, at least with a young audience, the tendency when they hear these is to retreat and withdraw and not be willing to engage. Well, that's quite the opposite of what we need to have happen. We need to provide at least a balance of, yes, the challenge of it, but also the hope that exists for it. And I think back to An Inconvenient Truth, which, of course, the film was popularized nearly 20 years ago by former President Al Gore, talking about how if you look into every crisis, there's also an opportunity that comes out of it. And I think that with climate change imperiling the planet, we also have tremendous opportunities that exist in front of us. And I want to speak to those here, as well as help you understand what exactly this whole policy thing is. So if we can move on from these challenges in terms of gloom and doom, let's talk about the hope. And I'll start here with a little history lesson. It's what I've been doing for 24 years at Bellevue High School, is teaching history as well as other aspects of social studies, but it's history perhaps nearest and dearest to my heart. I want you to think back to an America in 1970. And for those of you who don't reside in the United States, you probably are aware of it a little bit in terms of America now 50 years ago, 51 years ago, that we lived in a country that was tremendously industrialized, and the opportunity then to be able to see the changes that have taken place there as well. Just a comment there that came in as far as PowerPoint and presentation mode. I was hoping it was full screen. Susan, can you give me a hand? Are we in full screen right now or not quite?
Yes, we are in full screen.
Okay, so this is what I've got to share. Hopefully we can make that work for folks if they're seeing something different. Appreciate your patience with that. I'll continue then. And again, do feel free to throw those questions in there. If there's something wrong, let us know so we can help make it work better for you. If you take a look at the numbers that are on screen there in the top left corner of the pollution levels, and if we take a look at Seattle, I can read those out if they're a little small for you. When we consider micrograms per cubic meter, we understand that the World Health Organization categorizes anything over 10 micrograms per cubic meter as hazardous. So in America in 1970, in Seattle, where I live, 65 micrograms per cubic meter was the normal average. Think of Los Angeles with over 100, Phoenix with double that in the 1970s, and different urban centers and rural centers as well, near factories and the like, that lived with this every single day. Well, how did we improve upon that? That was because of policy. And I think it's a hopeful message when we think about policy. If you think about the impacts of the Clean Air Act of the early 1970s and then the subsequent updates that have happened, this has brought us into at least for the United States, a nation that has much cleaner air, dramatically cleaner air than what existed now 5 decades ago. If you look at the chart on the bottom left, comparing China with some of its cities as they're facing smog and difficult circumstances there still today, we can compare it to what the United States has. Now look at Los Angeles, California. It's kind of right in the middle there. 15.3 micrograms per cubic meter compared to 107 5 decades ago. That's an enormous shift. We're talking about better than 85% reduction in terms of the pollution levels in the air. How did it happen? It's policy. It's policy. We have the opportunity to solve these things ourselves. As you'll hear, we have the economic ability to solve problems, and we've shown that here. We have the technological capability as well. The political piece is often the most difficult one to bring forward. And ultimately, in the 1970s and beyond, we met that challenge, and we'll see other examples of how we've done that as well as we continue investigating climate of hope. Now, if you're familiar with the Clean Air Act and know its story, you may be less familiar with the Sunshot Initiative, which speaks to, I think, one of the great pieces of federal policy in the last 10 years out of the U.S. Department of Energy. So what you're looking at here is the levelized cost of electricity in cents per kilowatt hour, and with 2017 as the absolute value for it. Back in 2010, if you were to buy solar for your home for residential applications, you'd be paying 52 cents per kilowatt hour, which is just not a competitive price with the fossil fuel options. If you're going to heat your home and the like, it's just no comparison. Solar was way behind in terms of what was available for a cost for a consumer. So the goal of Operation Sunshot from the US DOE was to try to push that cost down. Now, this is one where policy led, but there are a lot of other factors that helped along, to be sure. And look at the results. At the residential level, by 2017, that cost had dropped to 16 cents per kilowatt hour. The goal in 2020 was not quite met, but they were within 3 cents of it. They got down to about 13.3 cents per kilowatt hour in 2020. The new goal for 2030 is down to 5 cents. Will we hit? Thanks for your patience, everyone. I'll give a pause to see if we get back to that Sunshot Initiative chart. How do we look, Susan? Are we back?
Yes, we're back. And all I'm seeing is just your PowerPoint slide. So I think you're in good shape, although
Okay.
someone was saying they were seeing your desktop, but I'm not seeing your desktop.
All right. Well, I'll continue right about where I left off. And again, sorry for that interruption. Not quite sure what happened, but hopefully we're back in good shape. So just kind of resuming where I was cut off, or more or less there, was talking about the levelized cost of electricity in cents per kilowatt hour and that message of hope. And the last one that I'll point out here on this slide was the utility piece, because I think it's kind of our greatest success, what we've seen here, from 28 cents in the 2010 cost, all the way down to meeting that goal 3 years in advance in 2017 for the 6 cent per kilowatt hour goal. Now, in 2030, the goal is to chop that in half again, to bring that down to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. But just this spring, the U.S. Department of Energy decided that they would advance the goal a little bit. Now the goal in 2030 is again 3 cents, but that's not just the cost of solar PV, it's also the cost of battery storage in addition to it. So to bring the total cost down to 3 cents for solar PV as well as battery storage is pretty ambitious. And if you know, I mean, batteries right now, they have a lot of functionality, but we're struggling to get beyond really 2 or 3 hours of storage in terms of battery time. The hope is that we'll be able to get to something that is 10 plus hours by the time we get to 2030 at that cost of 3 cents per kilowatt hour. It's ambitious, it's necessary, but ultimately, I hope what you're seeing here, despite our little interruption, is that opportunity and that hope that exists there for us. Let me do one more as far as that hopeful message, and it might be the greatest accomplishment, really, of the international community. And I think a lot of folks in my age group and beyond will remember this. I remember being a kid back in elementary school, and they were talking about the hole in the ozone layer and what that meant for humanity, the threat that it posed. And science showed us in the 1970s and early 1980s that we're seeing this decline measured by Dobson units and the integrity of the ozone layer. And the international community came together with what to date is the only completely ratified by every country in the world United Nations agreement in terms of the environment. That is the Montreal Protocol of 1987 and the updates that happened since. Ultimately, what happened was we replaced chlorofluorocarbons in our industrial processes with other substances, including hydrofluorocarbons, which we know have a bit of an environmental impact. But the result has been, through our carefully coordinated international effort, resolution, or at least a big movement towards resolution of it. The anticipation right now, using the best data that we have, is that by mid-century, we will have solved the issue. The hole in the ozone layer will effectively be resolved by that point. And we're already seeing the data pointing clearly in that direction now, and really for the last several years. But as we get into the 2020s, we're on the right track with it, definitely too. So hope, right? And not ignoring, not being ignorant to the challenges that we face and the disasters and crises as they continue to arise, but understanding there's that hopeful piece of where we're trying to go and the possibilities for it. Because, well, we've done this before on a different scale, mind you. Climate change is bigger than any of these things, but it shows what's possible. It shows what we have done when we have the opportunity to work together. Okay, I'm going to do this section and then we'll come to that pause that was suggested earlier. Not a technological breakdown pause, but hopefully one that's more constructive. So let's talk a little bit about one of the challenges that's there for really any citizen to be able to differentiate good from bad climate policy. So how do we know what's good? How do we know what's bad? How do we know what to advocate for? What makes good climate policy? I'm going to pull from my favorite climate journalist, David Roberts. He does a podcast called Volts now. He used to write for Vox, VOX, as a magazine and the like, and I think he's one of the best in the business. And he talks about how, and there's this great metaphor for it, when we think about what's needed, he mentions that clean electrification is kind of the entree at the dinner table. If you follow that metaphor for a moment, everything else is just kind of a side dish. I mean, side dishes can be useful. It's nice to have an appetizer, but the main entree here is clean electrification. Elsewhere, Roberts mentions that what we need to do, the basics of it are, We have to electrify everything. That is your home, your car, buildings and the like. And we have to green the grid. We have to make green our resources in terms of electricity. It's nice to have an electric car, but if most of the electricity that's generated for your home comes from coal-fired plants, you're really just extending the tailpipe. So greening the grid and then also getting us the chance to be able to electrify everything fits right in with what David Roberts is talking about. We can think of the work in two parts. Job one is to rapidly push fossil fuels out of the system using the technologies and strategies that we have on hand, such that we reduce carbon emissions by about 50% by 2030. And job two is to research and develop the technologies and strategies we will need to continue rapidly reducing emissions from 2030 onward. That's the harder stuff. The low-hanging fruit we need to pick here as quickly as we can. But the stuff higher up in the tree, the more technologically challenging pieces, that's what we'll get to after 2030, and hopefully successfully so that we're able to hit net zero on or ideally before 2050. The images to your left represent, I think, some of the scope of the problem. If you take a metric ton of carbon dioxide and measure it as a sphere, it's a ball about 33 feet across. That's a metric ton of CO2 as a gas. Well, New York City about 5 years ago, one of their the offices of the mayor actually put out these couple images as well as others that help visualize the nature of the problem. So in the top panel, you're seeing New York City with 1 day of New York City's CO2 emissions is sufficient enough in those 33-foot across balls, those spheres, to be able to bury the Empire State Building and then some. That's 1 day's worth. Down below, 1 year of New York City CO2 emissions creates a peak that is as tall as anything in the United States. I mean, it buries most of New York City and the like for it. That's massive. That's difficult to comprehend. And yet, when we think of that, we're talking about 55 million tons of CO2. So when we talk about the entree, not the side dishes, not the appetizers, but the entree, we have to be able to take on the bulk of that. We have to address the issue head on, and we don't settle for simple peripheral solutions. So that's one city at the scale for it. Let's consider a little further here as what makes good climate policy. And we'll turn to Bill Gates next, who's often in the news. This comes from his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And the two numbers that he recommends to really boil this down are 51 billion as one number. And then the other number is 0. Obviously, we need to get to 0. We need to get to 0 ideally by 2050. Currently, we're at 51 billion as far as 51 billion tons of CO2 equivalent that we're pumping into the atmosphere every single year. That's our reality. That's our challenge. Now, he mentions, if you look at the chart there to the right side, that ultimately what we're looking at here is a breakdown in terms of the different aspects of it. Emissions probably dropped about 5% in 2020, according to Gates' book, as he estimates, due to the pandemic. But in a normal year, we're pumping out 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And 31% of that is making things, including steel, cement, plastic, and so forth. 27% globally is producing and transmitting electricity. 7% is keeping cool and staying warm. 19% is raising animals, growing food, forestry. And then 16% for the planet is vehicles, planes, trains, et cetera. Although it's noteworthy that that 16% for the planet for the United States is actually the biggest slice of the pie with better than 30%, because we fly and drive a lot more than the average person does in terms of the planet. So it's something to think about in terms of the breakdown for this and ultimately what we have to do. If we're going to have serious carbon policy, if we're going to have good climate policy, we need to have policies that address the bulk of that as quickly as we can. We need to bring that 51 billion tons down by half over the next 10 years, essentially, and then down to 0 by the time we get to 2050, or at least a net zero situation for it. I see the comments there. I will be happy to get those slides your way there once we wrap up the presentation. Happy to share, as you know. Now, this is not without challenge. We know how difficult this is going to be. And ultimately, to continue to break that down a bit, let's think in terms of the national and then a little bit more the regional or provincial and state level. For the United States, of that 51 billion tons, 6.5 billion is ours as of 2019. Obviously, it dropped a little bit for 2020, so 2019 is probably the more predictive number. For Washington State, it's approximately 99 million tons. So if you look at the shares of this, as we break this down at those different levels, we should be moving towards policies that are effectively chopping those right in half over the next decade, the next short decade until 2030, right? Canadian emissions are smaller than the United States, smaller population to be sure, and they have some policy, I think, that's been doing good work over the last decade, whereas the United States has less of that. 730 million tons in 2019 for Canada as a whole. British Columbia, approximately 62 million tons, according to the Government of Canada's estimates. So to the point, good climate policy is going to address those head on, that it's going to bring those numbers down again by half for the United States, down to hopefully 3.25 billion tons or less by 2030. For Canada, bring it down there well below 350 or 370 million tons by the time we get to 2030, and then to zero as we can by 2050. So if that's kind of our bellwether for good climate policy, what makes bad climate policy? Now, I want to keep in the letter and the spirit, as Susan suggested to us there. We're not going to go, denigrating any candidates or parties and the like. But in terms of bad climate policy, to think about it, this is where we get into some rules of thumb and the like. And I think the obvious is that bad policy either denies the existence of climate change, or it supports actions that are inadequate to the task at hand. Especially here in the United States, that we get narrow windows of opportunity to do much about this. We're in such a window right now. And for those who would continue to deny the existence of climate change, I'm sorry, but that's just not an argument that's credible. It just isn't. We follow the science, we see what's there, and we don't have time to be able to live in this position that's indifferent. And for those who would support actions inadequate to the task at hand, the goal is to bring them to something that is adequate, to continue to pull, and to bring us to a point that's going to be much stronger in terms of policy. If we think about greenwashing, and this is something that you maybe have heard of before, just to define disinformation disseminated by an organization so as to present an environmentally responsible public image. This exists in many corners of society. It's to an advantage of individuals, of organizations, to say they're doing a lot on this topic. But the challenge for us then is to think critically and to see really how well are they doing. The bottom line question is this: which policies lead to curbing the majority of global emissions by 2030 and which don't? Now, one of the tools I use in my classroom, as Susan mentioned, and has been kind of introduced in the last year and a half or so, is called En-ROADS. This comes from climateinteractive.org, and you can see the snip there of the image to the right for it. This is an interactive where you can decide, hey, if I'm going to solve climate change, what are the levers that I'm pulling in terms of policy? Am I going to bring down the supply of coal? Am I going to decrease methane and other emissions? Am I going to promote afforestation, that is planting more trees? Am I going to limit deforestation? This is a really dynamic tool that gives you a chance to see what your policy choices do in real time, and it impacts ultimately the graphs that are on screen. And there's a number of graphs. This is rich and complex. So I would recommend that one definitely, and actually I'll throw that into the chat space here for those who want to maybe play with something in the background or take a look at it on your own time, and give you a chance to be able to consider it. It's a really powerful tool, one that takes a little explaining for it, but if you take a look at it, I think you can gain a lot from it, and ultimately it can help you make those choices about what's good policy, what's bad policy, what really is moving the needle, and what is not. So feel free to look at that one. That's freeware from MIT's Sloan School of Business. They make that available for everyone. It has a ton of things at Climate Interactive. It's been one of my great resources that I use for my classroom. And it's the base ultimately for that climate summit that Susan mentioned earlier that I do with my students every year. Okay, we are at 2:32, and I guess even with the glitch, that puts us at a little bit of a halfway point. So Susan, I've been throwing a lot at everyone. Shall we make this our decent break point before we get into Policy 101?
Yes, Randy, sorry, I was having a hard time getting to my mute button. Yes, that would be fine. And I just want to mention that we'll have a few minutes now with Joan. Joan, feel free to take all of the time that we've provided to you. And if you need to take a break to get water or something like that, do that now. Thank you, Randy. We'll see you in a while. And I'll turn it over to Joan then.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Randy. We understand that we're throwing a lot of concepts at people and that some of this may be challenging for our heads to keep up with, especially my head. It has more challenges than it used to in keeping up. So we wanted to build in a time for a reflective pause. So I would encourage you all to get comfortable in your chair and close your eyes. We're not going to have any pretty pictures up on the screen. You're not going to miss anything. And just let your breathing draw you into a space of quiet, a space of peace. And rest for a minute in that space where we can connect. And in this space, I want to read to you a very short segment from words provided to our church in recent years by our President, Steve Veazey. Just to let this wash over you in peaceful reflection. Collectively and individually, you are loved with an everlasting love that delights in each faithful step taken. God yearns to draw you close so that wounds may be healed, emptiness filled, and hope strengthened. Be vulnerable to divine grace. And as we continue to rest in this state of peace and calm and connection, I will read those words again. And again, just let them wash over you and speak to you however they will. Where is the Spirit's invitation to you in these words? Collectively and individually, you are loved with an everlasting love that delights in each faithful step taken. God yearns to draw you close so that wounds may be healed, emptiness filled, and hope strengthened. Be vulnerable to divine grace. Amen. Thank you for taking a few moments to rest and reflect. And Randy, I'll turn it back over to you. We're recharged and ready to go.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joan. I'll bring us back to right where we left off. And I think that as we transition back into the presentation, I can't think of a better way to comment on that great break than to note that for my students, I try to impress upon them the importance of taking breaks. It's not something you can do every day, 24 hours a day in this. There's work that needs to be done. We all have to find the right pace that allows us to go the distance as opposed to just a sprint. So as we engage in the marathon with this, we'll keep that very much in mind. Okay, so policy. When we think about this, I'd like to kind of couch the remainder of the presentation with the framing of like local, regional meetings, state or provincial level, and then also the national piece. And we'll make a nod to the international bit as we finish up here in a moment, but this is much the framing of the remains of the presentation. Let's consider different examples and what exists out there in terms of policy. Now, I'm going to start with Bellevue, Washington. And this is one I'm pretty familiar with because it is where I teach. I teach at Bellevue High School. And Bellevue, Washington has, the city of Bellevue has become one of our partners at Bellevue High every spring for the last few years because they have worked to put together an environmental stewardship plan. So if we're going to apply that critical thinking lens that I suggested to you earlier about what's good policy, what's bad policy, we have an opportunity to do that here first and to understand some of the complexity of it. The challenge of judgment is that we often miss opportunities of understanding. And so I'll try to help you find that understanding as we go through here with this policy and then other levels as we proceed. So the city of Bellevue has an environmental stewardship plan. It has many aspects to it, but the one that most directly relates to climate change speaks as follows. Their goals, their key strategies are to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to promote sustainability across sectors. They want to increase resilience to climate change impacts. They want to institutionalize consideration of climate change across city activities and decisions. And they hope to educate and inform residents, businesses, and city staff about sustainability issues and solutions. If we look at this, we have to understand that the city of Bellevue is a rapidly growing community. And if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions over the last 10 years, from 2011 to now, as the graphic on the left suggests, they've had a 26% reduction in community-wide greenhouse gas emissions despite 20% population growth. Now that's notable, certainly. Anytime you're looking at a community that is growing rapidly and they've been able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, that's certainly steps in the right direction. Is it enough? Well, the city of Bellevue, and as we'll see with King County, has fallen short of their goals, their 5-year goals to be able to reduce by certain amounts their overall greenhouse gas emissions for it. And as well, we should note, as we mentioned earlier, that 2020, of course, is a COVID year. So a lot of the big drop that takes place here is in no small part because of the way that people changed how they work, how they travel, and the like over the last year. Is that permanent? Yeah, we'll see. But for the city, they at least have the framing for these goals and the like. I know other cities in the area, to shout out again Annie Phillips for her work with the city of Burien to promote their own climate plan. The challenge is to get them to go beyond measurement to real policy to actionable pieces. And I think Bellevue is at the starting point for that, but there's certainly more room for them to grow. So given that consideration, let's step to another level of local government. And that is King County, which is a county that I live in, the most populous county in Washington State. And King County has a strategic climate action plan, or SCAP, that is updated every 5 years. They've had that for most of the, or better than the last decade, really. And the 2015 SCAP, before the new one that started in 2020, had the following accomplishments. First, it launched frontline community climate partnerships to support climate literacy and development in communities of color. Now, we can't overstate this enough. The importance of centering communities of color and our frontline communities is paramount, because otherwise, well, these are communities that usually have the greatest problems first and have the best solutions last. So we have to center those voices. We must. We have to provide that understanding for it, as opposed to just leaving them to kind of fend for themselves with it. So the county has been focusing on that, I think, is laudable, definitely. Since 2010, they've been able to stabilize their greenhouse gas emissions and lead to an 11% per capita reduction. Note that that doesn't really speak to massive reductions in the overall greenhouse gas emissions. They've been growing. King County is one of the fastest growing counties in the United States, certainly in Washington State. But to be able to stabilize it, to flatten the curve with it, is no small accomplishment. Clearly, more is needed. And despite efforts, including planting 1 million trees in King County, along with a certified carbon credit program to protect local forests, there's more action that's needed. And I think where that turns us to is the challenge of, as I teach my government students, the challenge of federalism, where you have this power sharing arrangement. Not one entity has all the answers. You depend on other levels of government. And one of the challenges here for county governments and certainly municipalities is the challenge of funding. To be able to fund all the solutions themselves simply isn't possible, even if they close off all other parts of their budget. They need help. They need help from the federal level, from the national level to be able to do more, and from the state level, they need guidance too. Now, if we head north of the border a little bit to British Columbia, their carbon tax, which has been in effect now for nearly a decade and a half, is an interesting model to consider. For those of you who don't know what a carbon tax is, a carbon tax basically puts a price or adds a price, certainly, to a certain unit of fuel. Usually that's per ton of carbon. And so, for example, if you have a $15 a ton carbon tax, what does that look like to you? Because none of us goes out and buys a ton of carbon just for the heck of it. If you do, that's interesting, but most likely not. Usually that goes to something that is a price per gallon is where people see it at the most. So in the price of petroleum or the price of gas, a $15 per ton cost for a carbon tax will usually be 12 or 13 cents a gallon-ish is the rule of thumb. Depends on certain factors. Maybe the fossil fuel company decides they're not going to put that on the consumer. They'll just eat that out of their profit margin. But usually $15 per ton usually makes 12 or 13 cents per gallon. Now note, in British Columbia, which was one of the first really regions, I think, and certainly all of North America to implement this, we saw some interesting results. Note, if you follow the graph here back in 2007, as 2007 is 100%, you can see the drop off in terms of refined petroleum products. But in 2008, 2009, those were recession years. So the drop in consumer demand is pretty predictable and you have an economic slump. But note, the real important part, I think, comes from 2009 forward. Look at the gap. Look at the delta here between Canada as a whole versus British Columbia in terms of the sale of refined petroleum products. This is the kind of progress that we need to see. And the carbon tax not only led to a difference in terms of how much gas was being bought in British Columbia versus the rest of the country, it also raised revenue. Over the first 6 years, it raised $3 billion in revenue. And for those provincial governments and local governments that are always cash starved, this is a boon. This is an opportunity. Now, that price is currently set at $45 per ton of CO2e, and it will rise to $50 per ton in 2022. So the price is going up in terms of this. That cost is notable. What does $50 per ton mean? Again, it depends on certain factors, but you're probably looking at something that's better than 35 cents per gallon at the pump. So something to consider there in terms of the impact of it. And the corresponding consumer behavior is this. They'll either buy less gas, they'll eat the cost if they want to continue to drive as they have, or they'll seek out alternatives, perhaps Zoom and work from home, perhaps public transportation, perhaps even that option of maybe an alternatively fueled vehicle, or at least one that sips gas instead of gulps it. So think about that and the impact of it. Now, the revenues have been used to do a variety of things: green energy initiatives to green the grid as part of that solution we're talking about, and also to limit price impacts. The climate action tax credit comes out to $174 per adult in British Columbia and $51 per child in 2020. So a lot of that cost is offset by the fact that the revenues are largely pushed back through the system and brought back to consumers as a credit to them so that they don't feel the pinch as much. Now, smart consumers, goes the theory, will say, all right, I'm going to get $174 per year no matter how much I drive. What if I don't drive at all? Or what if I drive a vehicle that doesn't use gasoline? Guess what? You're still going to get that $174 per year. So there might be an opportunity to incentivize behavior here that not only limits the amount of gas they use, but pushes them in a more constructive direction. So consider that for regional policy as ideas. We'll loop back to this idea of a carbon tax here in just a little bit. Now, in Washington State, in terms of some of what we see here, Washington State, obviously you can note by the dates, is well behind British Columbia, our neighbor to the north, in terms of what they've been doing. But the reality is we're starting to catch up. In 2019, we passed a clean energy standard for Washington State, which means energy generation in Washington State by 2025 has to be significantly much more based on renewables than it is right now. And coal-fired energy by 2025 is simply going to be gone from our portfolio. So we're moving in the right direction. But ultimately, beyond the energy sector, we need to think about all of our greenhouse gas emissions here in Washington State. So I'm proud to say, as a native Washingtonian, I was born in Washington State, I've lived in Washington State, I plan to reside in Washington State as long as I can, that just this year, Washington State Legislature passed the Climate Commitment Act. And it was signed by Governor Inslee into law here this spring as well. Now, one of the pieces that gets interesting, and Susan, you asked me to bring this up, so I will here definitely, is that question of the power of the veto. Why would a pro-environment governor like Jay Inslee use a veto on something like the Climate Commitment Act? Well, he had a specific purpose. When it passed out of the legislature, the Climate Commitment Act was linked to a future transportation package, one that hadn't been passed yet, one that might be passed next year or maybe beyond that. And that was ultimately the deal that was made by legislators to get this through. Well, Governor Inslee used his line item veto to basically strike that part, to get rid of the linkage and to allow for the bill to go into effect much sooner. And so that's an interesting piece, along with the low carbon fuel standard that was passed, that also had that line item veto that showed the prioritization of it in Washington State to make up for lost time. When we think about what it does, this policy implements a cap and invest program that limits carbon emissions statewide, beginning in January 2023 and expanding over the next 8 years to cover 80+% of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. Once you get to something that comprehensive, we're talking about a pretty big deal. This is the entree for Washington State. This is not an appetizer. This is not a side dish. For our state anyway, we're looking at the entree right in front of us, and it's a feast. And it includes something that's probably not getting much headlines, but is very important. Oftentimes when legislation is passed, you have to come back to it 5 years or 10 years down the road and reauthorize it, which means you're dealing with a future composition of that legislature. Not the case here. There's no sunset provision with the Climate Commitment Act. It does not require reauthorization by the state legislature, which means it continues until the work is done by 2050, hopefully before 2050. So something to think about. And you can see by the graphs here, the estimates from the Department of Ecology, that you're going to be looking at this driving down the hard limit for 2020 and then pushing down further by 2030, by 2040, and then ultimately by 2050 based on just this piece of legislation, the overall cap and then the reduction that will happen there. The revenues will be used to invest into greening the grid. And we'll see how that goes certainly with it, but ultimately that's the goal, that's the policy and the priority of it. One last thought for the Climate Commitment Act. There's the opportunity to link with other states. And California is certainly the one that is the bellwether, although this policy is actually more aggressive than what California does. It is possible to link with California to make not just Washington State in a silo and California in its own big silo, but to link them together into one kind of carbon market. But the challenge with that is that ultimately, since their laws in terms of offsetting emissions are different than ours, that you get into a question of negotiation. You might be able to link them, but will you keep that carbon price at a level that basically drives down emissions, or will you water down the result and take longer? So we have to wait and see. For now, there's no linkage with California. It's possible in the future, but that's something that future governments will have to figure out between our respective states in California and Washington. All right. Now back to Canada here as we look at the national level. And I'll do my best to follow the chat. Haven't seen questions yet. We'll perhaps save them to the end, but I'll try to respond to them as they come. Canada moved well ahead of the United States in 2018 by passing the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which in many ways models what we've already seen in British Columbia for the last decade plus. It's part of their national goal to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions at least 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. Now, why 2005 levels? 2005 was the year that Canada and the United States used as kind of their benchmark to see when they were at their peak carbon, right? Since 2005, both the US and Canada have shifted a lot of their electrical generation away from coal over to natural gas, which at least is purportedly cleaner. I think with methane gas emissions, you look at a lot of offset for that. But in any instance, by most measures that we have, 2005 was the dirtiest year for the United States and Canada. And we've more or less plateaued since then for each of the United States and Canada. So for Canada now, to go beyond where they are, they use 2005 as kind of their yardstick as the dirtiest year and where they want to go by 2030. So to reduce that by an additional 30% is no small thing. That is addressing in a lot of ways a significant sized entree as opposed to just an appetizer. So a goal worth continuing with. It is a rebate model, and you have households receiving 90% of the revenues in that. the typical Canadian household will make more than they pay in higher fuel costs. So again, incentivizing consumer behavior, and eventually, hopefully, people will start to realize that, look, it doesn't matter how much I'm using this, I'm still going to get this same piece as far as a rebate. So what if I use zero and still get the rebate and pocket the difference? Hopefully that's what consumers are starting to think in Canada. Be interested to know more on that, most definitely. So national policy in the United States. And with this one, noting a comment that's jumped in as well. Yeah, and yeah, Tom, I see that question there, and I can allude to it here for a second with it. Skagit County, as you mentioned, certain Washington counties charge an extra fee for automobile license tabs who can serve by buying electric. Yeah, and I think that the question about that as a responsible policy is one that I definitely have as well. For example, you mentioned Skagit County, $75 per year for hybrid vehicles. In King County, and we're in ST3, right? We have the Regional Transit Authority here for us. The price that I pay for owning an electric as opposed to a conventional vehicle is more than that. It's actually $150 per year that I have to pay because I'm not paying anything in fuel taxes. So it's a good question. Is that responsible policy? If I had a magic wand, Tom, I would make it show that they're paying us if we own electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. I don't have that magic wand. If you see one laying around, hey man, I'm all ears. But the challenge is ultimately states have to look for revenue in terms of continuing to fund things that we still need with transportation. Maybe the best model will be one that disincentivizes us from even owning cars of any kind and using entirely public transportation and pushing to electrify that. We're not there yet, and we have to continue to evolve it. So it's a good question to ask. I appreciate you bring that up for our attention with it. When we think about that,
Randy,
yeah, go ahead, Susan.
since you've paused in your presentation, could you also
Sure.
check the chats? A couple of comments before Tom Weber's. There's another Tom who
Sure.
put a statement. If you could read that and respond to it. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And noting that there, and the challenge in terms of it, replaced by new thinkers, you know, I think by 2030, I hope we do have a new generation of thinkers. And I think that ultimately for the United States, we can't suppose that we have all the answers. And I think too that for my students, as I speak to them, they know that over the next few election cycles, it's increasingly going to be them. So I think that far from wanting to get rid of our scientists and officials, we need to make sure that we are following best science and the best leadership. And what I try to do with my students is to be able to show them what that looks like here as we go forward, because ultimately, as the generational shift happens in the United States and elsewhere, by 2024, the most numerous part of the electorate is going to be the millennials and the Gen Z folks. It's the folks that are well younger than I am now. We want to give them the best information we can. We want to promote the best thinking there. And that's part of the reason why I do what I do, not just in terms of teaching, but even these presentations with those folks here that are present. So hopefully that gives some thought for it and encouraging best science and making sure that we follow that. Would a carbon tax and dividend plan work in the United States? That's a good question. And I think that if it holds true for Canada in terms of the function of it, you can imagine that it would be possible to work here. It has not yet gone into heavy consideration in Congress. There are bills like House Resolution 2037 that speak to this idea and that include a carbon fee that would put a price on fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, that it would start low and it would grow over time, similar to what has happened in BC and now Canada generally. This would drive down carbon pollution because energy companies and leading industries would have to move towards cleaner and cheaper options unless they wanted to pay more. That it would include a carbon dividend where you're basically paying people and bringing that money. And it would be, in this case, for HR 2037, it would be 100% of the money would be returned to the consumers. And something to consider as far as that. The government would not keep any of the money from the carbon fee, which might be more popular. And then a border carbon adjustment as a part of it as well that would make regions of the world a little choosier in terms of what they import. If a border carbon adjustment were in effect for the United States, it's not yet, but if it were, the United States would essentially look at all of its trading partners and say, okay, for those countries that we trade with that have environmental standards that are the same as or better than ours, they don't have to pay anything extra at the border to sell their goods in the United States. But for those who have dirtier economies that are selling products in the United States that have a bigger carbon footprint or carbon shadow, as my good friend Christy Scoresmith likes to say, then ultimately they would have to pay an extra fee that would make them less competitive. You're seeing the European Union look at that right now. That's been in the headlines over in the EU for much of the last 6 months. If they start one, as it seems that they will, other parts of the world will probably have to follow up with one of their own. So this may be something that is coming here, no matter what we do, because it's hard to imagine one major trading block in the global community having this and the others not. They would most likely raise their own border carbon adjustments in kind to be able to respond to it. So almost like a game of dominoes with that one. We don't have a carbon fee and dividend plan in the United States yet, but there are ideas that exist. Great comment from Dorothy here. I want to acknowledge that elementary age students want to protect the earth and will follow what we teach, but also they challenge it and call us to task. Absolutely, we need to support them. I totally agree with you, Dorothy, whether it's elementary age students or my high school students. They not only want to see that future for themselves that's promising, but they're going to look at us and say, why aren't you doing more? And that's part of the reason I do what I do, definitely, to hold myself accountable, because ultimately I'm just renting this planet and every generation has the chance to be a renter as well. We need to take good care of it and be good stewards so the next generation doesn't have to clean up so much. Now, the policy that's sitting in front of Congress right now, and there was some news about this just the other day, is about a clean energy payment program. And for the United States, this is the game changer. This is the entree that David Roberts suggests to us. And the simple idea here is that if it goes into effect, utilities across the country would have a carrot and stick structure. If they go with more renewables, if they move more towards clean energy, then they get money from the federal government. If they go the other direction, or if they stay dirty based on coal or even natural gas and the like, then they take a financial penalty. So this drives people forward with the carrot and stick structure. Now, if it were to pass by 2040, you can see the clean energy that the United States has as a percent of its overall electricity generation would double by 2030. So in just 9 years, you're doubling the amount of clean energy in the United States. In 2005, compared to a 2030 for CO2 emissions, you would look at a 86% drop if the CES was put into effect and the Clean Energy Payment Plan was put into effect. That's enormous. That's going even perhaps beyond what we would need as far as by 2030, but inspiring. And for SO2 emissions, one of the great air pollutants like for sulfur dioxide, reducing that by 93%, mostly because coal dies under a clean energy payment program. It can't survive. It goes away very quickly. And nitrous oxide as well, another of those important greenhouse gases that doesn't get much credence, but is way more potent than even methane is. But that drops by 76% under a CES or a clean energy payment program by 2030. So this is tremendously promising. The bad news that we got just in the last 48 hours is that certain members of the United States Senate are now coming out in opposition to this, which means getting to the 50 votes that we need now seems far less likely. There's an opportunity to be able to push back on that, of course. And I would encourage everyone here, as I'll show you in a moment, to be able to speak out, to be able to stand up for that great solution that we're looking at here in terms of a clean energy payment program, or what other of those really entree addressing pieces of policy that you have out there. And we'll speak to that here for the last part of the presentation next. How to get involved. Appropriate place to end, that call to action. And I hope you all take it seriously. I'm sure that you will. When we think about how to get involved, I want to point out again that same structure, national and then provincial and state, and then even local for it as well as we move to the conclusion of it. And before I do, noting a comment there. Got it. Yeah. And I think to your question, Susan, the drawbacks of the Reconciliation Act overall is the challenge of getting it passed. And the Clean Energy Payment Program would be one small part of that reconciliation bill. Reconciliation is a cumbersome, slow process, but the benefit of it is that you don't have to worry about the filibuster, and that it could possibly pass the Senate with as little as 51 votes. And so ultimately, we see that in terms of the challenge for it, but also the opportunity that's there. Whereas conventional legislation, like if the Clean Energy Payment Program were to go just as a normal bill in Congress, it wouldn't need 50 votes, it would need 60 to be able to overcome the filibuster that it would likely receive. So food for thought with that. Appreciate that question.
Yeah, excuse me, Randy.
Yeah.
The purpose of my question was really to ask, are there reasons why it would not be a good thing to pass the Reconciliation Act without getting into parties, without getting into
Sure.
politics?
Yeah.
You know, if I were one of the people that was against it, what would I be thinking?
Yeah, I think those that would be against it would be worried about spending because originally the idea was for it to, the headline, of course, be a $3.5 trillion set of investments. Now, those investments would be spread over 10 years. Paul Krugman from the New York Times, who's an economist that I respect his opinion a lot. We don't always agree, but I respect his opinion. So that effectively you're looking at something that would be $350 billion investments every year. And in an American economy that right now exceeds, what, $24-25 trillion in its total value annually, we're talking about a pretty minuscule investment that has massive outsized results. So the criticism is about the price tag and the concerns that are there regarding inflation, especially in an economy right now that has these bottlenecks from different challenges where demand is outstripping supply. But when you spread that over a decade, I think you ameliorate a lot of that, would be my retort to it. And then ultimately, can we afford to wait on these investments or not? Another comment?
Thank you very much.
You bet. Yep. And Kathy, I totally know what you're talking about, and I totally hear you. Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. So for national representatives, how do you get involved? Well, I want to bring a little metaphor to the table here that comes to me from, again, David Roberts' podcast at Volts, and a guest that he had from the Clean Air Task Force. Her name is Sarah Smith. And she made this beautiful connection, I think, that fits well into our time here today, hand in glove. She said that, look, advocacy for this issue, or really any other, needs to be something that we think of the same way that we think of going to church every Sunday. We know that when we go to church, that we don't solve all the world's problems in one sitting, that we aren't able to deal with all of our own existential crises or those of the planet or our community in one sitting. But we know that if we make regular investments, if we make this frequent, that we can make a difference. So I think that's not a bad idea. I think that makes good sense, that if we're going to make a difference, it's not something that we say, hey, I made my phone call, I'm so done. You need to make your phone call on a regular basis. You need to go to those town halls. You need to reach out by email. You need to do those things as regularly as you can. Not everybody can do it every day. I mean, that's a lot, but weekly, think about that. Think about that as your model. Can you take even 10 minutes a week to be able to write an email to your elected representatives at the national level and hopefully at the state or provincial and local level as well? That's the investment. That's something more along the lines of what Sarah Smith was imploring us to do. For the United States, link there as far as for elected officials. I'll try to pop that in the chat here as well for it. And then also for Canada in terms of the Commons, Parliament and the like there, the opportunity to make those regular investments. Think about that every week. What does it mean to take that time for it? I'll put that in here right now, just as far as those links. Feel free to use them as you need. So thinking about that as far as that chance to connect and make that difference is enormously important on a regular basis. At the state and provincial level, same idea. Realize that if at the national level, to move the needle, you need thousands and maybe tens of thousands of phone calls to be part of a broader group for it. Well, at the state and provincial level, moving the needle is a lot cheaper. There's simply fewer people that are engaging in it. So if you need maybe 10,000 phone calls to move a United States senator or 10,000 emails or a combination of such, at the state or provincial level, really you need something that's in the hundreds. For example, and Annie knows about this as well, back in March, we had the chance to be able to speak to one of the committees that was considering some of the environmental policies here in Washington State, to our state legislature. And we made a little bit of a record from Annie's work, from my work, from a lot of other activist work, and from some of my students who happen to know they could jump in on this as well. They made over 1,000 contacts, that is phone calls, emails, and the like, to one committee in the Washington State legislature to say how much they wanted the piece of legislation known as Washington Strong. We didn't get that passed, but what we did do was we made the Climate Commitment Act include some of the provisions of Washington Strong. And that was because of advocacy. We moved the needle with several hundred calls effectively. So think about that. State and provincial officials, especially in committees, they'll get dozens of calls sometimes, but hundreds is pretty rare. So think about that. What does it mean for you to get people to help you out and make contact and reach out? And as you can see there, in terms of BC and Washington State, there's the opportunity for you to make contact there. I'll include that there in the chat as well, as far as a great way to find your elected representative and to put that into. All right. And Erica, I can see your question there as far as the policy. Were you referring to the, oops, I think I just sent it to Susan. Sorry, I'll put that out to everybody. Joys of multitasking in Zoom. Erica, could you clarify for me as far as the policy? might be the Clean Energy Payment Program you were considering. I think that's the one you were referring to. We'll watch for that as it comes up. All right, and let's move down to the local level now. And that includes school board and includes the city level. It does include the county level too. And realize that as far as getting involved with this is where a single voice, if it's the right voice, I think can make an impact as long as it's frequent. Or a couple dozen voices can make a really big impact, to be sure. So think about this. For school board, for city, for local council, we need to push for policies that accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels and focus on equity for frontline communities. That's the entree. That's the main course here that we're looking for. And when we think about that, I have to come back to an experience that my family had back here in August, and that relates to the image, the video that you're about to see. Seattle Public Schools is our most local of entities here that we interact with every day. And I'm sure many of you interact with your school board far more than you do members of Congress. That's just the reality of our life. So when we think about it, we have that chance to provide leverage for it. Now, back in August, I had this opportunity that came my way to be able to address the Seattle School Board because they were considering how they wanted to structure their next levy coming up in February of this coming year. And the opportunity was there to be able to say, hey, we need to focus on these pieces. We need to remove fossil fuels. We need to do these things going forward with that money that's going to come from the levy. And then I thought about it and I thought, you know what? I've got 2 students in the Seattle Public Schools. And I know at least one of them would be willing to speak to them. So I talked to Spencer. Spencer is my oldest son. He's 12 years old. And I talked to him about it and I said, here's the opportunity. He said, yeah, I'm willing to do that. Okay, great. And as we got closer to it, we found that it wasn't going to be kind of a Zoom meeting or just an email. Instead, it was going to be either be on a phone or to speak in person. And I asked him what his preference was. And he said he wanted to go speak to them in person, which I was blown away by. And so we worked on it a little bit. I offered to help with a little script. And he said, you know, when I make my YouTube videos, I kind of do this freestyle anyway. So I don't really want a script. Okay, here's a couple talking points. Now, he had the chance, along with my family, to attend that school board meeting, which is what you're seeing in that picture. And there we have the elected members of the board across the front, as well as right in the middle, the acting superintendent. Spencer's here at the mic, and haltingly, in about 60 seconds, you're going to hear his address. Now, he had to deal with some tech issues. The microphone wasn't turned on. There was a glitch and the like, but he persevered. And to get up there and speak truth to power in that is impressive and obviously a source of great pride for yours truly. Let me share this with you. Hopefully I can get the audio to work right.
Why should we do this? It can let students live longer and fuller lives. And we can set an example for our state.
Excuse me, Randy. Have you pushed the button that says share? When you share a video, it also says share sound.
Ah. Well, we should do that, shouldn't we, Susan? I was worried about the audio there, and sharing video on Zoom is new to me. So let's see what we can do with it. And the challenge will be to find that piece since I'm more of a Teams guy.
So
Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
there's some options at the top center of your screen for the further, and one of them that says share computer sound. Or you could stop sharing your computer screen and then share it again, and it'll pop up as on the bottom as one of the first 2 options at the very bottom left.
Let's try that. There we go. Got it.
Okay.
Thanks for the save. Let's try again.
I'm here to talk about the February 2022 Clean Energy Levy. Why should we do this? It can let our students live longer and fuller lives. And we can set an example for our state. How can we do this? We can, in buildings that are being remodeled, add electric heat pumps and electric stovetops. And replace aging and broken natural gas heating and cooking with newer electric ones. Thank you. I yield the remainder of my time.
And again, my son, Spencer Litzenberger, speaking to the Seattle Public School Board about 5 weeks ago. Thank you, Susan, for the applause. Appreciate that. Absolutely. I'm pleased as punch with the work he's done and so proud. But it's also, I think, a good example for us to think about, with a chance for my 12-year-old to go up there in front of a group and to speak his mind with a little preparation, mind you. We all have that chance. And, in person, through comments and the like. Shout out to Susan, who also called into that same meeting and shared her voice with it, the Seattle Public Schools as well. We all have the opportunity to engage. We all have the opportunity to make a difference. We all have that chance. And some of that chance takes us to the broadest focus of all. So as we conclude and we look ahead, the next step is Glasgow. And the COP, or Conference of Partners, the 26th meeting of such, will take place in Glasgow in Scotland here in just a couple of weeks. Now, this, of course, was supposed to happen in 2020, but as you've heard, COVID. And now they've rescheduled and they're on track to be able to meet here in a couple of weeks' time. 30,000 delegates representing 197 nations are expected. And ultimately, when we think about this, as we watch this, as we follow it, as we see the headlines that are sure to come our way about it, there are really three ingredients, according to Energy and Climate Intelligence, to be able to give us a sense of whether it was successful or not. First, what happens in the year before the Conference of Partners, COP26 in this case, to advance climate ambition? Now, all nations are expected to provide updated national determined contributions as part of that 2015 Paris Agreement to continue to ratchet up their ambition. What have countries done? Are they coming to the table showing that, hey, we have policy that we've enacted, we're doing this at the national level, so the rest of the international community needs to follow us? Will the United States be able to claim what Canada has by saying we've enacted policies, or we're in the process right now, it's going to happen? Or are we going to be left with kind of empty words in terms of wish we could have, but we didn't? That's part of the challenge. That's the first way to measure in terms of whether a conference will be successful or not. What are countries doing to advance their climate ambition? Second, how successful the official negotiations are at the Conference of Partners, including the high-level segment with heads of states and ministers from around the world. This is where the real horse trading, to use an old term, comes on. We get the chance to be able to see them engage with each other, really push each other, and ultimately talk about how not only their national determined contributions will go, but how will they help finance countries who need that help to be able to turn to this. Not everybody can afford to create megawatts and megawatts of solar. They may need help from the international community. So how do we make that financing possible? How do we put $100 billion a year at least in play for countries to pull from and say, yep, I'm going to use this, certify it, show what we're doing with it, but this is going to green our grid. This is going to electrify everything for us. How do we make that happen? It's going to require financing from the wealthy countries in the world. And third, what emerges? What comes out of this? What progressive coalitions and alliances will emerge for action on climate change to implement the Paris Agreement and beyond, to continue to build that skeletal structure that was the Paris Agreement and to put flesh on the bones to make it living, dynamic, breathing, to meet the times that we have now. The Paris Agreement was a starting point. We have to go beyond that if we're going to meet our goals in terms of reducing our emissions. And ultimately, the challenge comes back to us. How are we going to push our leadership? How are we going to force them to engage? What will we do to engage ourselves to make that all possible? So I'll leave you with this as we consider the future and the Conference of Partners. I know you all be watching. I know I will be for sure. Here's my contact information. I'll share that for you if you wish. Consider that in terms of the chance to reach out to me if you have questions. I'm happy to respond to those there or here. Thank you for the opportunity to present. It's been my great pleasure. I'll stick around for your questions now.
So if I look at the schedule accurately, we've got about 12 minutes left. I think, for those of you who are here today, I guess I want to remind you that we have in 1 week an opportunity to ask questions of Randy further. And I think what I'm going to do is just maybe give a minute or two for anyone who wants to ask a very quick question. And then I'll make some closing remarks. And so I'm going to look for people to raise their hand, and if others can look at the screen too and let me know if someone's got their hand raised. Nancy?
Yeah, the question is FEMA. And I was thinking about Puerto Rico, and I was thinking about their electrical grid. and the fact that it had to be completely remade. And somebody said, what in the world are we doing paying for the electrical grid to be remade in the same old way instead of making it more clean? And the same thing for emerging countries in Africa. Why are we?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nancy, and I'll try to address it if I can. I think the challenge ultimately comes to policy and policymakers. Who's in position to make those decisions? What are we looking at in terms of for Puerto Rico? Because part of this is not just greening the grid and electrifying everything, but the other dimension that I hadn't brought up yet was that challenge of resiliency. If we rebuild Puerto Rico's grid to, even if it were to be based on renewables, but still have some of the same vulnerability to stronger storms and the challenges that we're all going to be facing in the Gulf Coast and elsewhere, then we failed. We need to have policy that says we need to harden these pieces of infrastructure, make them better. Hopefully we see something that comes out of this as far as the infrastructure bill that seems more likely to pass in reconciliation, but those are going to be parts of the solution, I hope, as we go forward.
Is there a piece of that that talks about underground wiring rather than above ground? You know, with those replacement kinds of things, the infrastructure bill?
I'd have to dig into that a little bit more, Nancy, to see right now, but I'd encourage you to take a look at it also to see if it has those components. I don't have that off my hip, but I can see if I can find something between now and when we talk further next week.
Thank you.
I think Rod has the next hand.
Yeah, general question in terms of dealing with your representatives. What types of advocacy work best? That is, you talked about emailing them, you talked about phoning them. You know, people can get these massive petitions to send to them. You can visit them. Then there's the whole issue of protests and, you know, both light and heavy. That is the light ones that are just marches and speeches, and then the heavier ones that are civil disobedience. Can you give any sense of, you know, you can't give a specific answer, but just in general, are there some that are paid more attention to than others?
Sure. I think what you tend to see, as I understand it, is that the ones that have the numbers behind them tend to be the more effective. So if you're looking at that chance, if I'm going to make a phone call to my senator, even if I'm calling every day, and it's something that few other people are advocating for, well, I'm not going to get that far with it. But if you're looking at something that has organization behind it and a broader message and something that has many people, I think the numbers count. And whether it's a call or an email or a petition, as you mentioned, Rod, those things are all crunched into data. Those numbers are shown to the senators and to the representatives in Congress and also in Parliament, I'm sure of it, to say, here's what the tendency is right now from our constituents and the like for it. When you get to questions of civil disobedience, obviously that's something you want to take with great care, because although we're all free to exercise our rights to peaceably assemble and the like, there are often consequences for that that are well beyond any United States senator and the like. So I always push for the argument that when you're looking at effective protest, it adheres to the principles of nonviolent protest. Now, there's ways to do that, and there's ways that are, I think, more aggressive. So I think we want to take some care with that. We know that once we enter something that shows that it's violent or destruction of property, history shows us that we're working against our best interests, that pushes us backwards as opposed to another constructive direction. So I hope that's a general answer enough for it, Rod, to give you a sense, but the numbers matter quite a bit.
So I'm going to mention a question that's in the chat, and it may be something that you can come back to next week, Randy, when you're here with us in questions. But it's what are some key questions or things to look for in candidates for when we are voting next month? And I assume we're going to stay into the legal realm that Susan advised us about when you answer that question. But let's defer that one until next week's conversation. Also, there was a question about, you know, could you give us a sample script to use when we write elected officials about these issues? And I think I'm going to defer that to next week, let you think about that. I saw, Michael, you had your hand up. Go ahead and ask your question.
If you look up the internet, there's a thing called moribund hard law. And this is where leaders adopt international treaties with binding rules, but then fail to enforce them or even carry out their provisions. And this can be done to look good and appease pressures from either non-government organisations or the international community itself, while not actually wanting the treaty because it doesn't fit with their neoliberal mindset. And in Australia, if Australia ratifies an international treaty, then they're obliged to legislate rules and policies to fit that treaty within the national level. But then you get these policies just sit there doing nothing because people don't do anything with them. If there's some way to address this would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably going to be the edge of it in terms of my knowledge of international law. So, Michael, I might have to punt a little bit there. But I think that the general challenge you're identifying is what happens when nations in the United States, if a president enters into an executive agreement that the Senate doesn't have to ratify, or if you have ratification of a treaty, but the lack of follow through. The broadest answer I can give is probably that ultimately that requires the push of the people to be able to follow through with. There's a lot that exists out there as far as what we're seeing in terms of market solutions, what we're seeing in terms of popular solutions for it. It does come back to the people to push for legislators, to push for national leaders that will look at that and take it seriously. I know, living in the United States, what it means to have our leadership not follow the strictures of the international community and international law. And that's something that we have to hold them accountable for at the ballot box. And if we fail to do that, then, well, I suppose we get what we deserve, right? Which is poor leadership. So that's a very general answer, Michael, if I can do so.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. So let me call a halt to questions now. I want to remind you that the recording of this session will be on our website within a few days. And if it's acceptable to Randy, we'll look at how to get the slides up and available, probably in some kind of a PDF format so that they are not altered or capable of being altered. And so we'll check in about that. But I want to thank you all for coming today for this discussion about Climate Policies 101. Again, please join us next Sunday at 2. You see, Rhonda, can you bring up the screen, the upcoming events, and then we'll go through that final set of slides. Or would you like me to do it? There we go. So again, I mentioned next week is the follow-up conversation. We're going to have a webinar in November about communities making a difference. We'll have some material about congregations around North America who are doing things. I think it'll be interesting for you to hear about, and then a conversation about that the Sunday following that webinar in November. And Randy's alluded to COP26, the Glasgow conference. I think our plan is to have him come back in January, having observed that, and give us his observations about what he thinks has occurred. If your congregation is involved in some effort addressing climate change, please let us know. Send a video if you have it or someone in your congregation has it to Rod at his email address, rdowning94@shaw.ca. So in preparation for our conference next week, I want to invite you to take some time during this week to think about how you might become active in your community in this time of great climate challenge. If you're already involved, please come prepared to share your stories about your engagement in this work. If your efforts are now at the personal level, reducing your carbon footprint, changing your lifestyle, for example, take some time this week to discern what you might do next and with whom. Deepen your commitment by finding some steps to take this week, putting into action what you're called to do as a part of being a prophetic people. Now, we often feel powerless to act in our complex world, or feel that taking power implies we're participating in the abuse of those in power, and that's something they sometimes display. But I've found encouragement in the words of Martin Luther King on the next slide to guide my own actions and to feel comfortable in exercising the power of group actions for the common good. And King said this: "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." And finally, we want to leave you with words from the last several lines of our poem, Bridge of Hope.
We all must be the blind leaders in the dark, mouths dry and singing prayers off key, our hands full of dust and pebbles and our grandmother's seeds. Be the mad woman leading the way. Trust your love and trust this path will change you. Trust others will join you. The only way off this crumbling cliff is to build this bridge. As you go, go every day to the edge of what you know of yourself, and then go beyond. There, you will find others singing a familiar song, becoming a new way together. There will be no name for this new place until long after we are gone. But you feel it calling, praying you into being. Go fly, do it now. I will join you.
Thank you all for your attendance. See you next week.